I'm Myron Kandel. A lot of people call me Mike Kandel. And I joined the New York Financial Writers when I became a financial reporter on the New York Times in 1960. Now, I'd been at the Times many years before that, started as a copy boy, working at night while I completed my senior year at Brooklyn College and earned a master's degree from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And then I worked on the copy desk for a number of years, and I was eager to become a reporter. There were 3 openings in the financial department all at once. In 1960, I applied for one of them, and I became a financial reporter. And all my colleagues at the Times in the financial department were members of the Financial Writers Association, and so I joined right away. And I really found it a great place. It was a place of camaraderie between professional journalists. It was fun. Financial Follies every year was great fun. I must say that I joined the Financial Follies cast. I was in the cast for 7 years and never got a speaking role. I was always an extra, carried a sign or did something like that. So I decided that was not my career. Maybe I should switch to another part of the Financial Follies. I became the stage manager. Well, it's interesting how I became a financial reporter. As I indicated, I was on the copy desk, and I was eager to, as a relatively young guy on the copy desk, but eager to become a reporter. And the city editor, who was my boss at the time, would say to me every time I'd ask him to make me a reporter, he'd say it's tougher to get good copy editors than good reporters, which is true to this day. And I guess it was a backhanded compliment, never gave me any more money for saying that. But then when there were 3 openings all at once in the financial news department, I applied for one, and friends in the department who knew me had recommended me. And the financial editor then said to me, why do you want to be a financial reporter? And I said, well, I studied economics in college. And he thought that was great. And the fact is, I did study economics at Brooklyn College. It was ECO 101, which was a required course. Now, over the years, I've taught journalism at City College, at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and I've spoken at college campuses around the country. And I tell that story, get a big laugh, and I say, let that be a lesson to you. Never lie, but you don't have to tell the whole truth. So I would recommend young people today, if they're really interested in journalism, that some of the best opportunities are in financial journalism. Now, these days, financial journalists are better trained than I was. They don't all have to have MBAs, and they all don't have to be economics majors, but they should certainly know something about the field, which is something back in my day, all those years ago, was not definitely required. I should add that when I was hired to be a financial reporter, I would go, after I finished my work on the copy desk, I couldn't start for a number of weeks because it was the middle of the summer and there was an elaborate vacation program schedule lined up for people on the copy desk. So I had to continue on the copy desk for about 6 weeks before I could become to the financial department and work as a reporter. Every night of those 6 weeks when I finished work on the desk, I would go to the morgue, which is the library of clippings that every newspaper had in those days, and I would read up on the fields that I was going to cover. And the fields I was assigned to cover was sort of fortunate. If they had given me the bond market, I would have flamed out in about a week or less. They gave me the fields of retailing, 7th Avenue, meaning women's clothing, and men's clothing, and textiles. So I knew a little bit. I had some relatives in those fields, and I knew a little bit about retailing, being a shopper myself. But I did study up the clippings that other reporters before me had written, and by the time I started, I had a fairly decent grounding, so I was self-taught. in the fields that I was going to cover. And that's important. Whether it's a new field or not, you should get as best grounded you could become before you start. Well, one of the advantages of being a member of the Financial Writers, in addition to the fun we had and the camaraderie, is the ability to meet and interact with other journalists. And over the years, as I rose and became an editor and executive, I was able to hire people because I knew not only their professional work, but I knew their personal attributes from getting to know them socially and through the Financial Writers. So that was a great thing that I think, and I think it's helped people over the years. Many people have gotten their jobs because of contacts they made as being members of the Financial Writers. Well, there is a difference in the Financial Writers today. In those days, there were many newspapers and magazines that don't exist today. So we had a much larger active membership. For example, the Follies was loaded with 30 or 40 members on stage at any given time, and that diminished over the years. And also the nature of the business changed. When I became a reporter on the Times, I had one story to write, and I could go out for lunch, sometimes a leisurely lunch. Other people did 3 martini lunches, I didn't do that, but I have been with people who did. But you could do it because you go out to lunch. Your deadline then those days was 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, and you had plenty of time to write a story in the afternoon, even if you hadn't done any legwork before. Or frequently the lunch was developed into a story. So it was much more leisurely than it is now, with 24-hour news, 24-hour social networks, and the pace is much, much different. So it was an easier time, I should say. One of the things that I enjoyed particularly in Financial Writers was running a series of luncheons. I did that for a number of years, and I had some of the most important people in American business as guests. The head of General Motors, the head of W.R. Grace, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, et cetera, et cetera. And we would do monthly luncheons. Occasionally we'd do a breakfast, and it was with a business leader or even a government leader. Those were great fun, and people could get away from their desks and attend for a luncheon, because the luncheon would last from the time we gathered to the time it was over, 12 to 2. So you figure it was 3 hours out of your day. It generally was in Midtown New York, frequently did at the restaurant Gallagher's in the theater district. And that was great fun because we had the opportunity to meet these people in a rather informal session. We didn't expect them to deliver great speeches, but the Q&A was always very interesting and quite stimulating. And sometimes, and frequently actually, it resulted in news. So that was a fun part of doing it. You can't do that anymore. People can't get away. Originally, we didn't have women members. I don't think we had women members until the early 70s. And so during the Financial Follies, guys would dress up in drag. And some of these guys looked pretty good in drag. One in particular was a guy named Jerry Sherman, who had been a reporter for the Journal of Commerce, later had his own PR firm, and then was a corporate PR executive. Jerry was a very good-looking guy, and particularly when he was dressed up and had a lot of makeup on or whatever. And the story was that this financial editor of a major newspaper had a little too much to drink and really came out onto Jerry Sherman. And Jerry never appeared in the Financial Follies again. He refused to do it. One of our longest serving members who was on the who was in the Follies. He used to joke that he spent 50 years on Broadway, but he couldn't sing, dance, or act. His name was George Auerbach, who had been a predecessor of mine on the New York Times, then went into public relations. And George was a faithful a participant in the Financial Follies and had a great time. And he always did a great job on stage, even though he couldn't sing, dance, or act. And there were many others like that. That was a fun part. And the thing is, the people in the audience in those days were major figures in the financial world and government world. I remember when I was president of the Financial Writers, the president always had a table at the Follies, and my guests included Paul Volcker, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. I've had major executives. One funny thing was, Paul Volcker was a ranking guy at our table, and my wife was present. My wife hated cigar smoke, and Paul Volcker was an inveterate cigar smoker. So instead of what I ordinarily would have done was put my wife next to Paul Volcker as the most important guy at the table, I put Paul Volcker at the other end of the table from my wife, and put someone else next to her who turned out, to her regret, to be a cigar smoker himself. In those days, people smoked cigars, cigarettes, and whatever. It was before the no smoking period that took place. Well, one of the things that the financial writers did was to maintain standards of journalism. And one of the reasons you did that is you knew your competitors. See, not so much anymore, but we all, you know, the Herald Tribune people, the New York Times people, the Wall Street Journal people, they all mixed and knew each other. If you ever thought about straying or writing, it wasn't fake news in those days. Occasionally someone would write a story that was incomplete. And if the next guy or his competitor did a much better story, it would become obvious, and there was a lot of joking around. And so you would do the best you could just to, because you knew your colleagues and your competitors were doing the same. There's one famous story, I don't think it was directly out of the Financial Writers, and in fact, that fellow I mentioned before, George Auerbach, was a reporter for the Times, covered a luncheon given by a liquor company, and the reporter on the Herald Tribune was a guy who was known to take an extra drink or two, especially at an event run by a liquor company. Well, that reporter got totally soused, and George, being a wonderful person he was, wrote the story for him and had it delivered to the Herald Tribune. Somebody took it up there. And then he went back to the Times, which was a few blocks away, and wrote his own story. And the next day, his editor, financial editor of the Times, remonstrated with George. He said there was a better story on that luncheon you attended in the Herald Tribune than the one you wrote. And George, of course, never admitted that he had written both stories. One of the big differences between financial journalism in those days were the absence of women. There were very, very few women financial journalists. The first financial reporter at the New York Times was a lady who was very active, who became very active eventually in the New York Financial Writers. Her name was Claire Record. Women were not allowed, by the way, in the financial file. Not only on stage, they were not allowed in the audience. And the story goes that Claire dressed up in drag. I don't know if women dressing as men is called drag, but at any rate, she dressed up as a male and sneaked in to the Financial Follies with the help of some of her friends. And her byline in those days was CR Record. And one day, she was in the composing room where the paper was put together, and somebody she introduced herself, I think, to some of the, one of the editors, it could have been the publisher of the Times, as Claire Record. And he says, and the story that I've heard is he said, "Oh, you're Claire Record. I thought C.R. Record was a man." And she said, "Well, that was the idea. They wouldn't let me use my real name, only initials, because they thought a woman financial writer would not be treated as seriously as a male. So they had to use the initials." And he said, "From now on, your name, your byline is Claire." So there is a huge difference. And I think today, I'm not sure of the figures, but there are certainly equal number of women, or perhaps even some places even more women. And I think the profession is better for it. I stayed at the New York Times for a total of 12 years, with 2 years out for being in the Army during the tail end of the Korean War. And I spent the last 3 years as a financial reporter. From there, I became the business editor of the Washington Star, which was a great paper in those days. I left the Star to join the New York Herald Tribune as correspondent in Germany, covering Germany and the common market. I was in Germany when President Kennedy came and made his famous speech, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I came back from Germany to be financial editor of the New York Herald Tribune. When the Tribune folded in 1966, I became the editor of the New York Law Journal. And people would say to me, "How could you be editor of the Law Journal if you're not a lawyer?" And I said, "I'm a professional editor. I can be editor of anything as long as it doesn't have equations." Well, from the Law Journal, I started a newsletter called the Wall Street Letter, which was quite successful, sold it to a company called Institutional Investor, left there after a number of years to start a newsletter empire. I thought it was going to be a newsletter empire. I bought one newsletter and started 2 others right at the beginning of the worst recession before the one we had in the early part of this century. And then I started a syndicated column with an old Herald Tribune, an old Brooklyn College colleague who was an active guy in the financial writers as well, named Philip Greer. So we wrote a syndicated column that was in major newspapers around the country called the Greer-Kandel Report. We flipped a coin on whose name came first, and he won. And we did that for a number of years. And then a guy came to me who was starting something called Cable News Network, the first president of Cable News Network. And he convinced me that this would be something. Wait a minute, I forgot. In the meantime, Rupert Murdoch bought the New York Post and hired me as financial editor of the New York Post. And the New York Post got a little too sensational for my likes. And meantime, I was writing the column with Phil Greer at the same time and being financial editor of the New York Post. Then, as I was getting sort of fed up with the Post and its sensational format, a fellow came to me named Reese Schoenfeld, who was the first president of Cable News Network, and offered me the job as financial editor and on-air commentator for CNN. And I joined in the beginning of 1980. We went on the air in June 1st, 1980, and I stayed 25 years, leaving in 2005 on my 75th birthday.